So Jerry, have you ever wondered how in Windows 10 we've actually been able to implement Fluent and have all these wonderful things such as Acrylic, smooth animations, drop shadows, and so on?
You mean how pretty Windows 10 has become?
Yeah.
How fast it seems to do it all? Yeah, I've wondered how they do it.
Well, that's great, because on this episode of the DevRadio show, we're going to meet the composition team that's behind all of this.
Sweet. Hey, and welcome. This is the next episode of DevRadio. I'm your host, Jerry. I'm here with Darren May. Darren, thanks for being on the show again.
You're welcome. It's been a lot of fun.
It has. We've had a good series of awesome episodes. You've been my co-host, and it's been a good time. You know, this is also a good time for Microsoft. We are usually recognized for just like engineering and products, but designers are really our friend these days because Fluent is really popular.
Yeah, what's going on with the whole Windows presentation, it's just awesome.
It is, and I think a lot of people see it for how beautiful it is, think about it from a design point of view, and maybe don't realize the engineering part of it that's really behind the scenes making it happen.
Yep, there's definitely a lot of low-level work that went in to make this go.
That's right, and usually that falls all on the composition team. We have the composition team on this episode.
Excellent.
All right, we've got Robert from the composition team. Robert, introduce yourself before we start talking business.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Robert Mikhayelyan. I'm a software engineer on the composition team. I've been on here for 4 years. Yeah, that's about it for me. Why? No.
So you do nothing. Is that what you're saying?
Aaron could learn a few things.
So I've been pretty active in our kind of API design, reaching out to developers. Ran, I guess it's been a while since I posted, but a blog with how to use composition, author of the Composition Surface factory NuGet package to make image loading and text a little easier in the composition APIs.
Now, let's see, Robert, if I wanted to do something awesome inside my application in Windows, usually I got to drop down to DirectX to really have the performance that I want. That was sort of the beginning of where composition sort of plays a role and becomes in the middle, but a lot of people who are watching the show maybe don't really have a good grasp of what composition is. Give us kind of the background of what composition UI is from a developer's point of view.
Yeah, totally. So for a long time in the Windows platform, you basically had two areas that you could operate in. You could either be at the low level, as you said, with DirectX, or you could be at the pretty high level with Zamel, and you didn't really have a middle ground to kind of bridge those two. So if you wanted to get something more performant or you wanted to tweak things, you'd have to write a bunch of code from the bottom up in DirectX and then host it inside your XAML content to really get advantage of that. The composition API is a bit different. So where DirectX is an immediate mode graphics API, or a retain mode graphics API in the sense that you're not drawing every frame. There's no concept of drawing, but rather that you build the relationships, your visual tree in a very similar way as XAML works, of different primitives that the composition API provides to you. And the base primitive that we talk about a lot are visuals. So you can create a visual tree, you can add content to those visuals, you can animate them, and this is where the power really comes in from the composition API, because we can run all of these things out of your process. So your UI thread can be completely hung and your animations will still be buttery smooth.
So
perfect situation.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone builds their app that way. So how long has the composition capability been available? Because it didn't ship with the original version of Windows 10, correct?
So this incarnation of the API did not ship immediately with Windows 10. We were in a preview mode. But it was really in the November update where you could first use the WinRT form of the composition APIs. There was a previous incarnation that was available to Win32 callers starting in Windows 8 called Direct Composition. And that's still available if you really want to. But the composition APIs are both usable in UWP and Win32 applications.
And it's evolved quite a bit. What we saw in 10.586 was like, that syntax and what you would see today is really a different set of syntax.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things that we've had. What tends to happen is that we release a bunch of capabilities, we release a bunch of APIs. People come onto those, they build really cool things, and then we start thinking about how do we make that workflow easier, because not everyone is going to be jumping down, getting up into their elbows in composition code. So we try to add more things to make that easier. So instead of building, so technically if you really wanted to, you could build something that resembled Acrylic on a much earlier version of Windows 10 if you use the effects API and knew how to chain those things together, but not everyone wants to go do that. So then we made it easier to create their acrylic brush and all these other things that made it a lot easier for developers to just kind of come in, drop what they need to, come back out, work back in XAML. Or if you want to write your entire application, like I sometimes do in Composition, that's an option too.
So of course the platform team started leveraging those things such as the acrylic brush and the backgrounds and so on, and bake that and bake those into the platform controls.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the transparency effects that you see, or some of the shadows that you're starting to see in the Windows UI, and more going forward, I would say, are really using a lot of these capabilities and a lot of these APIs, because as we make these things easier, that's a real time savings for developers, so they end up using more of those features. Whereas if you're writing your projected shadows code by yourself, hand rolling it, you're going to spend like most of your time debugging and writing that code instead of actually using the shadows in your program. When we've done that heavy lifting for you, you can just kind of drop it in there and reap the benefits.
Where like yesterday's developer may have been writing a lot of composition script, tomorrow's developer is going to be writing XAML and getting the same effect. And even though they can still drop down to that script and get the edge cases they may need, you're likely going to meet the needs of, 80% of developers, more than likely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a position where if you don't end up ever using the Composition API at all, you're still benefiting from it in some capacity, because as we add more of these things, as the trailblazers, as Darren is, you've really shown us what we can do with the API, and then that ends up getting pulled into either the platform or into the Windows Community Toolkit, which has been a real big adopter of the Composition API.
So another question that often comes up when I'm chatting with the community is they go, oh, so it's Win2D.
Yeah.
Relationship there?
So Win2D is I'm a huge fan of Win2D. So for those who don't know, it is it's a WinRT API that resembles the capabilities of Direct2D. So instead of writing a bunch of WIC and D2D code, you can now write to one API surface, which is called Win2D. And it's super easy to use. It's projected in C#, but you can also use it from C++ in the same way that the composition APIs are. Win2D, however, is still an immediate mode API, much like D3D, DirectX. So you're still drawing every frame. You're maintaining that relationship about, is my device lost and stuff like that, which is a more complex concept in these graphics APIs. And you can use Win2D and composition together. So, for example, we're not in the business of making your bits, but we will cook them the way you want to. But you have to supply us with the bitmap. We're not going to show up with the image of a dinosaur. You need to draw that first with Win2D or D2D or whatever, and then hand that off to us. And then we'll, make it purple instead of green, or animate it and spin it around however you want. So Win2D and composition are a really good pairing together. But they're definitely different things.
And there's some relationship with the effects that you can apply to these images and so on?
Yeah, so a lot of the effects that we use, we actually share the effect descriptions from the Win2D library. So you're going to have to include Win2D anyway if you're going to want to use our effect system. And we just thought that, instead of having an entirely new effect description, we would instead come over to the Win2D community, pull their effect descriptions in, and now you can use, not all of them are supported, so if you go to the documentation, they'll be marked which ones are supporting composition and which ones aren't. And that's just because some of these effects are really expensive, so you don't want those done in a central compositor, because while this one app will look really nice, then suddenly the entire system grinds to a halt. So we want to prevent that scenario. But as we make these effects more and more performant, we bring them online for the composition API.
For developers who are listening and they're like, what are you talking about? What application do you point to? You're like, look at this effect. You couldn't have gotten this effect without composition. Look at this effect. Do you send them to, I don't know, calculator?
Well, Calculator actually does have it, doesn't it? Because of the background Acrylic.
Hmm?
Yeah, so Acrylic is one of these big things. A lot of times where you need readback of some kind.
Wait, and let me pause you just for a second.
Yeah.
So an acrylic is a background color that you can see through, and usually we see it as a blurry background.
Yeah, so it can be used as a background or foreground. In the Fluent Design system, it's usually some kind of background to a pop-up or something, some transient UI element. And that type of UI is, so you need to have what's behind it because you can see through it, but then you need to apply some kind of effect to that content because it's not just an opacity, we're doing some kind of blur, we're also doing, there's a noise map there, there's some exclusion effects, some color tint, and all of those things are, you have to keep in mind and you'd have to be rendering per frame. With the Composition API, you could do that in real time. It's a lot more performant because we're spending, we have loads of time that we spend to make sure that all that stuff works the way it needs to. So it's a lot easier to do because otherwise the alternative is to say you have your XAML app, you want to have a pop-up that's acrylic, even in application acrylic, not even window backdrop acrylic. And you have to then, let's say, do render target bitmap to get that stuff. You have to cut out the area where this UI element shows up. You have to make sure you're doing that at 60 hertz, and you have to put that in the tree. So obviously this gets really silly really quickly. But in the Composition API, you just plop in the backdrop brush, you plop in the effect description, and then you're good.
Yeah, even in early XAML, a lot of developers asked, "Where's just a simple thing like a backdrop shadow?" Right?
Yeah.
Like, when are you going to add that in? Like, we're not. Like, it's like unbelievably expensive. And but now Composition has changed that story. Obviously, we can because now we have this subsystem that's high performance that we didn't have before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the key thing is it understands the visual tree of how these things are rendered, whereas previously there were an After Effect faked onto surface during a composition stage.
Yeah. All right, so talk to me a little bit about the work that you're doing. I know that you are on the team, that each part of the team's doing different sorts of things. Talk to me a little bit about screen capture.
Yeah, so there's a new namespace starting actually it's already released, but in this new release of Windows there'll be a bit more features called windows.graphics.capture. And this is an API you can use to capture, windows or desktops that you have, or monitors, I should rather say. And that's how it started. But now we've added a new piece of functionality where we can actually capture visuals. So you can say, I have this visual and I want to get the D3D bitmap and a constant stream of them, not just one, from everything at this node. So this allows you to take a control and get the backing visual from it, and then start capturing it. Or if you have, I actually wrote a game using just Composition APIs, and if I wanted to, I could, for some of the more expensive effects, let's say, an effect that we don't support yet in the Composition API, we can capture that content, then we can run the expensive effect inside the app's process, and then display it using the Composition API. So capturing is kind of a niche thing when it comes to visuals, but it's something that a lot of people have asked for, so we're excited about that. Although this
maybe we should just clarify exactly what we mean by a visual.
Yes.
So if we've got a button control that's drawn on a XAML surface, there is a backing visual that is the output of the rendering of that button control. So it looks exactly like the button and it's actually what's being rendered up. So you can then apply effects to it. So say, for example, we wanted to just arbitrarily put a Gaussian blur on it. That would make the button look blurry.
Yep. Yeah.
And so when Rob is talking about the visuals, that's what he means. And you can actually get to the whole stack of those visuals because it's composed in a similar way that the visual tree in XAML is viewed, in that in a button you might have a label. In that label, you could turn around and put a rectangle and draw a red rectangle. It understands that same layer, so you can still do those sort of interactions with each of those various layers that compose that object.
Is a screen capture like this really intended for game use cases, or is there a bigger use case?
I think it's one of those APIs, I think, that we're going to realize there are a lot more uses to it than we originally thought. For the immediate thing, this would be like something Skype would use, for example. If you want to share your desktop and a picker comes up, you select your monitor, you click it, and then they get those bits back. They can send that over the wire. You can encode video. You can build GIFs. You can do anything that you want because you get the raw pixels back. So it's a lower level API, but it is one that provides a lot of power to the developer.
And is that being used in a lot of the new sort of screen clipping capabilities that's shipping in Windows as well?
Not immediately, but I think the plan is to in the future. When those were being developed and when Capture were being developed, they were kind of done in parallel and kind of away from each other at first. But I think the plan is to kind of move towards, because this is going to be the new way to do things on Windows as far as screen capture is concerned.
With so many things changing in the composition area, some of the new things that have started to come up are things like shapes, we know. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about what developers can see in that weird.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we're traditionally in the business of taking your bitmap and doing something with it. And there are some downsides to this. So let's say you drew a circle inside your bitmap and your bitmap was 50 by 50. But now you want to scale your entire application up, either because the DPI has changed or you have some kind of zoom-in functionality, and suddenly you start to see a lot of aliasing and a lot of artifacts because we've just took your 50 by 50 bitmap and blown it up 4 times. With the Shapes API, you can get basically the compositor has the basic shape information, so when it draws at a new scale, it knows how to draw that bitmap. So I guess this is a break in the rule that I gave before. We are now kind of in the business of drawing your content, but you have to do it in terms of paths and brushes, and kind of similar to vector graphics in a sense. And that's been one of the bigger things that we've tried to look for, because this also allows more interesting animation. So you could have something kind of deform as it moves or something like that, if you can time those animations right.
And nice micro animations, which we're seeing a lot in the web.
Yeah.
It's been something that's been missing for a long time from Windows. We always used to have that animation back in the day where you're copying a file between folders, and you would see this file flopping across, and that was just a bitmap, and obviously it didn't scale very well. You see on the web a lot of these little swooshy animations and so on and so forth, written in animated HTML and so on, or SVG, I should say. How's that looking?
Yeah, so one really popular one that's used actually by Airbnb and a bunch of other companies is Lottie. And as my colleagues have been working on, they're hoping soon, I'm not actually sure what the roadmap is, but they showed it at Build this year of Lottie for Windows. So you'll be able to actually take in an input file, a JSON file that you normally use with Lottie, and it will create the right composition shapes, and you can use the animations and scrub through them and all this other stuff. And it's basically brings the expressibility and the animations that already exist and people have created in Lottie, and pairing that with the performance and power of the Composition API.
Sounds good. Is that something you can show us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right, Robert, I can see your screen here. What am I looking at?
So this is just my desktop that I cleaned up with my junk pile in the background.
Obviously.
But it's rendered in 60 frames per second.
So this is the Lottie viewer. And basically you can drag your JSON file. So I downloaded one from the Lottie website, one of the samples they had. And here's, like a animation like you'd see on, I guess, the Twitter doesn't use stars anymore, but this would be, something similar. Mm-hmm. And using a bunch of different composition APIs, so this is using like one of the animation clocks, so you can actually go and scrub through the animation and watch it. This will render great at any resolution because, at any scale, because, again, as we said, we have the basic geometry on how to draw this, so we can always replicate it and redraw it at the appropriate scale that it needs to be. And dropping this in is pretty easy. You can, I'm going to actually pause that. It's very distracting.
Thank you. Oh my God. A warning of seizures to our audience.
Jerry was just starting to drool, actually.
But it's just a control, for the most part, that I've taken a peek. It's a control that you can drop in. You can have it parse your JSON file. And which is a really easy way to like embed a lot of these animations into your applications and kind of make them more vibrant and alive. You can also do them by hand. You don't have to actually use Lottie if you don't want to. If you're someone who likes to take the big hammer and write things yourself, like me, you can do that. So I have a small application right here. So there's a couple things going on here. This is actually from Darren's blog post. I highly recommend that you check it out for Shapes Animations. Here you see the hello world. You can actually get the geometry. I used Win2D to get the geometry of a text run and then fed that into the Composition API. So then you can do different, so there's like a black stroke color with a green fill. You could do a different fill. You could do a gradient brush or something like that. You can do at different scales and everything. You don't have to worry about the text looking really bad. I had this failed attempt at a save animation over here on the right. We're just going to pretend that like my awful eyeballing of a floppy drive isn't bad, or that the audience just doesn't know what floppy drives are. And then here's a little play pause animations. Fairly easy to create. It's just two pieces of geometry, two paths you can animate to kind of fake coming together into one piece and coming apart. So one thing that you need to keep in mind for path animations is that the number of control points needs to be equivalent on both sides at the start and at the end. But aside from that, then you can kind of interpolate these to whatever animations that you want.
And you can see a lot of application for these things in things like advanced graphs and charting and those kind of things as well for a lot of the animations.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. A lot of the startup animations that you get for charting applications could be much easier done using the Composition API in this way, because you can go from animate from deadline to spiking upwards for your sales or whatever, or down in the toilet if you're going bankrupt. But
you can go either way. One nice thing about this, Robert, I'll be honest, especially on the Lottie side, is I'm glad it's not the Microsoft animation approach. And instead it's like we embrace one that's already there that so many professionals are already using and know so well.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a tendency to reinvent the wheel, and at this point we decided that there's this really rich library of animations. People really seem to like it. It's a model that we can support. So the team that did this did a really outstanding job putting this together. Really proud of them.
Cool. So this sort of animation is it's a lot simpler than a scripted animation inside Composition. You would do that on purpose so you could reuse it. And we probably will see this show up in a XAML control someday.
Oh, absolutely. I'd be very surprised if this doesn't show up in XAML. People have been asking for shapes and shape animations for such a long time that once it's here, or now that it's here, I'm sure everyone's going to be chomping at the bit to get to it.
Nice.
And if you have an idea, put it out there online, tweet it at us at Windows UI. We'd love to see it. Maybe it makes its way into the community toolkit. Maybe we take some of those ideas that the community really likes and consider them for the platform or whatever. We're really trying to make sure that the developer's life is easier, and the things that developers want to do, they don't have to go and write a bunch of infrastructure just to start doing those things.
So we're kind of looking at what's coming tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a little bit about the developer experience today. A developer is looking at this and they realize if you can do it, they can do it. They want this. Where do you point them to get started so they can do cool stuff like this?
So one great place to look is the GitHub that we have, GitHub repo for our sample gallery. So if you go and download the sample gallery from the store, the Windows UI sample gallery, or UI Composition sample gallery rather, I think we just renamed it. You can go and just kind of see a sampling of different things you can do with the Composition API. Then you might find one and go, oh, I kind of like that one. So you can go and click through, and it'll actually take you to the page on the repo that actually shows how to use those APIs. And there's a link that I can send out as well.
Here's a better question: is it the right time to get into Composition?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Is this the correct time? Is this the right time to get into Composition?
It is always the correct time to get into Composition, but right now specifically, it's never been easier. Honestly, it's a lot of new features that are going to make your life a lot easier when you're trying to implement something a bit more expressive, a bit more fluid. Composition is going to be a lot easier to use.
Is this a UWP only technology?
No. So you can use this in Win32 applications as well. There's some issue of using WinRT APIs in Win32. There are some differences you need to be aware of. So for example, in a UWP application, you have by default a dispatcher queue for your thread, which is required to create a compositor, which is like the basic cornerstone object of the entire API. There's like one extra step you have to do on Win32 where you have to create this object explicitly before you create a compositor. But for the most part, it's really easy to use. We have some samples actually out as well. Highly recommend taking a look at C++ WinRT if you're going to do composition in a Win32 environment, because that's the easiest way to go. I think the language projections work out a bit differently if you're not running as a UWP, so I'm not quite sure about that one.
Can you leverage composition in Zamel islands?
Yes, absolutely. So in those, basically, Zamel does the heavy lifting for you because they're going to set up the compositor and the dispatch queue and all that other stuff. So you can come in and kind of just steal their compositor and like you would in a normal Zamel application and just kind of insert your visual tree into it. So this is also doable through Zamel islands if you want to go that route.
Wow. What a good question. That's clever. Darren, give me a practical use case that you've been able to kind of demonstrate in your own code.
So in the earlier days, I was doing some of the Acrylic work myself when it was first released. So some of the applications that are leveraged for a large media company where we built the Xbox app used a lot of the low-level composition APIs to create very high-performance controls that had a lot of images that we were loading in through the low-level image loading APIs that allowed us to transition and animate smoothly. We also did a lot of the connected animations because composition is what facilitates the ability to click on an item on one view and then have that animate smoothly into a new location whilst that other view is being populated, and then transition between that floating visual and the underlying control that's displaying it. So there's a lot of that low-level plumbing that we're now starting to take for granted in building these rich, fluent apps is facilitated by a lot of this low-level visual manipulation.
You know what's funny is, especially Xbox users, they're so accustomed to seeing that happen. They don't even know what's going on. You know, it's just such a subtle animation that an app without it looks a little dull, and they can't really put their finger on why.
Well, and that's one of the key things and why I think composition is so important, is that prior to composition, trying to do that on a very visually complex XAML application that was running on Xbox.
Yeah.
Although Xbox One is obviously very powerful, it's still not equivalent to a desktop running SLI 1080 Ti NVIDIA cards and so on and so forth. It doesn't have that same horsepower.
That's right.
So to be able to get close to the metal and have the metal help accelerate all of that capability inside your Xbox media applications makes them so much richer and more engaging in a way, as you say, that people are expecting when they come from the game world.
Right. Robert, help me dispel one thing I think a lot of developers assume, and that is if I can offload from the UI thread onto the GPU, I can basically do anything. And that's kind of true, but it's not really true, right?
Yeah, there's this expression that a lot of people just have, like, oh, if it's on the GPU, it's free. And it's like, well, it's not quite. So, like, obviously that work is still going to be done as the central compositor for Windows. We do get some preemption on CPU time or GPU time. So we may be able to do a better job than you can do inside the application. But if you create, like 1 billion visuals and have them all floating around, like, you're probably going to bring the machine to its knees. So as we try to allow it to scale, as far as we can, we make it very performant. But at the end of the day, there is a finite resource that you're using on the machine, whatever power that it has. And if you're using, like 10 backdrop blurs like on top of each other and increasing blur radiuses or radii, you're going to have a bad time. It'll probably still work, but it's not free, right? But it does give you a lot more headroom to work with.
Beautiful won't be beautiful after a while.
Yeah.
So I know I can use this on the desktop. Obviously, I can use it on Xbox. I know it works on HoloLens. What about something like IoT? Can I run this on a Raspberry Pi if I write a UWP application?
So yes and no. Particularly on the Raspberry Pi, we don't have graphics acceleration. So you could run it, but it would be running on Warp. So it would be your best option still.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. The Dragon board still running IoT.
So the Dragon board does. I think the Up board does. I think some of the other ones do, but like the Raspberry Pi is one of the outliers. But for the most part on IoT, if you can get graphics acceleration, Composition is available to you, and it's still available to you on the Raspberry Pi. It's just not as performant as you would prefer it to be.
Yeah, and then also, P.S., refer to the previous conversation.
Oh, yeah.
They can only do so many things. All right, so that's because Windows 10 is Windows 10, right? That's the idea.
Yeah,
that's pretty wild. So, all right, we've seen kind of the evolution of Composition coming all the way back from where it was first introduced to us. It was kind of the same power, but the syntax was a little bit more tricky. Now, of course, we've taken a couple of workflows, wrapped them up into APIs that are easier to use. We know that there'll be Zamel controls. There already are some. What's the future now of Composition? Where are we headed? What else can we do?
So a lot of things that we're looking at are maybe more of the very first category where we're trying to make things possible. So we're trying to look at some of the new things. I'm not going to give it up just yet because I'm not sure if my teammates will appreciate that. But some of the more...
Like what kind of stuff are you going to mention?
Sorry, what?
Nothing. I'm just teasing you.
Okay.
Well,
it keeps cutting in and out for me. Sorry.
That's convenient.
So, but they're looking at taking some of the experiences that people are trying to build today, and they can't. Like, they just straight up can't unless they drop down to D3D. We're trying to find a lot of those and bring them into Composition, and then those will be kind of like the Composition diehards will probably latch onto those, and then the release after that we'll try to make those easy for everyone, kind of on this alternating cycle for everyone.
Yeah. Now, you created a game out of all Composition, but just to be clear, Composition is not the game engine for Microsoft for sure.
No, absolutely not. What I did was absolutely nuts. But it was more of a, like, could you do this if you really wanted to? And the answer is, yeah, you could do it. Some, like, Game Boy style RPGs and stuff.
Halo. I think it was Halo 4. I've played it. It's fun. A lot of dual wield. It's terrific. All right, listen, Composition overall is funny because it's just one of those features that developers are like, I'm not going to learn it. Well, you're going to learn it. You're going to use it anyway, like it or not, because it's just built into everything slowly. Everything just slowly absorbs all of it, and it makes everything beautiful. And all of these things you can't maybe put your finger on why it's so nice. That's one of the reasons it's so nice after all. And your team's really putting together some really neat stuff, and this has been a fascinating conversation around Composition. Yeah,
thank you. I'm always happy to talk about Composition. We try to be invisible, because if we're doing our jobs right, you won't notice that we're here. But every once in a while, it's good to pop our heads out from the load of work that we're doing and tell people about what we're doing.
Nice.
Sounds great. Good to see you again, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Good to see you, too. And thanks, Jerry.